I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Helena De Bres, who joined the Wellesley Philosophy Department as an assistant professor in 2008. She received her PhD in philosophy from MIT and was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford's program on global justice. Her research focuses on political philosophy, in particular on questions of distributive justice in global politics and international law. She has published on pluralism about global distributive justice, the moral justification for the state system, and fairness in international trade, and is currently writing a book on global inequality. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. It's great to be here again. When most of us think about global justice, the first and most urgent, disturbing problem that springs to mind is the fact of severe and widespread global poverty. So let me cite some representative facts. These are from the Human Development Report, which the UNDP puts out every year. So this is last year's. Almost half of the world, that's about 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day. That's just over $900 a year. 1 billion children, that's almost half of the children in the world, live in poverty. 22,000 children die each day for poverty-related causes. 1.1 billion people in developing countries lack adequate access to water and basic sanitation. And another 500 million on top of that lack access to electricity. And this is from the United Nations Program on AIDS. An estimated 34.2 million people worldwide have either HIV or AIDS. That results in millions of deaths each year for AIDS-related causes. 69% of those people live in sub-Saharan Africa. When we're faced with these facts and other facts like them, a couple of obvious and urgent questions come to mind. One question is, what is it that explains these facts? So what are the causes of extreme poverty worldwide? Another one is, why do some countries have so many poor people and other countries not have that many poor people, relatively speaking? Next set of questions are to do with how to solve the problem, not how to explain it. So you might ask, what measures are most likely to reduce global poverty? Is it integration, greater integration into world markets? Is it increases in development aid? Is it climate change mitigation, maybe? What are the best ways to do something about this problem? Another question might be, how can foreigners help people in other countries who are suffering from extreme poverty? Is this something that really only insiders can make a real dent in? Over the next few weeks, as you attend the various presentations and work on your group projects, you're going to be looking at many different answers to those questions and ones related to them. I want to talk, though, about another question that's kind of lurking in the background here. So this is a question that's less often explicitly addressed, and it's the subject of my talk this afternoon. So when we speak of global poverty as a problem, and we talk about it as something we want to fix, we're assuming that its existence is troubling in some way, that we have some reason to do something about it. But why should we think that? Poverty is certainly a very serious problem for those who suffer it. But you might wonder why it's a problem for us. And when I say us, I'm talking to you and me, affluent citizens or residents of the developed world. One reason for us to care about global poverty is just a self-interested one. The existence of systematic, long-term poverty in many countries around the world represents a threat to the security, maybe the prosperity, of people in advanced countries too. So poor countries can be the breeding ground for terrorism, crazed dictators, drug trafficking, infectious diseases, various risks of that kind, and they can cross the borders of poor countries into into rich countries. So that's a reason to worry about global poverty. But I think I can safely assume that you all being Wellesley students, that you're not just concerned about that sort of self-interested reason to worry about global poverty. You also think that there's a moral reason, a strong moral reason to do something about this. So the question I want to address today is, what kind of moral reason is it? Why exactly should we care about extreme destitution in countries other than our own? So I think it's a good idea on this first day of the Albright Institute. You're all fresh. You're about to go into great detail about very many pressing sort of social science questions. Just step back a little bit and think about this deeper question that underlies some of those concerns. We're not going to come to a final answer on it. Final answers are pretty rare in philosophy, sometimes frustratingly. My students hate that about the subject sometimes. But I hope that what I talk about today will give you at least some resources to come to your own conclusions about these questions, or help you to think about them a little more systematically. So the plan for my talk today is a pretty simple one. I'm going to give you two different answers to this question. why should we care about global poverty, that come from two different, very influential political philosophers. And then we're going to talk about the attractions and the problems of both of those views together. So there's going to be some interaction in the session. Does everyone have a handout? Good, okay. So the first answer that I'm going to talk about is based on what philosophers call a positive duty to assist the global poor. So that's a duty to do something active, to provide resources that will relieve the distress of the global poor. Second answer is based on what philosophers like to call a negative duty. So that's a duty to cease doing something. So you're supposed to not do something that you're doing. So that's a slightly more unusual argument, but hopefully it will be clear what it is by the end of the talk. So let's start with the first, maybe more intuitive argument, which is the positive duty to assist the global poor, on the first page of your handout. This is an argument that was given in 1972 in the article that you read by Peter Singer. There he is. He's an Australian philosopher who has been at Princeton for many years. He published this argument in that paper you read, one of the most famous papers in moral philosophy. And he's also recently released a book, 2009, where he elaborates the argument at greater length, but the basic structure of the argument hasn't actually changed very much at all. So he still thinks it's right. He just has more to say about it now. So the argument is listed for you there on the handout. It's fairly simple. I'm just going to go through it slowly with you and then ask you what you think about it. The argument begins with two simple premises. These are claims that Singer claims are pretty widely shared. So they're intuitive premises. The first one is suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. That's step one. Step two, if it's in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, then it's wrong not to do so. Both of those premises seem quite plausible when you see them the first time, right? The first is a little more obvious than the second, maybe, but they seem like they're right at first glance. Bertrand Russell, another famous philosopher, once said that the point of philosophy is to start out with something so simple as to not seem worth stating, and then end up with something so absurd that no one will believe it. And many people think that's exactly what Singer does with this argument. He starts with these very intuitive premises and comes to a really startling conclusion. So to see how he does it, we need to look at what Singer does next after making those first two claims. What he does is he presents two cases. Oh gosh, oh, wrong mouse. Here we go, case A and case B. So the first case, you're supposed to imagine yourself wandering around, maybe on campus, past the lake on a beautiful winter day, and you see, well, not that one tree because it can't be iced over. The pond is not quite yet iced over, and there's a child in there drowning, right? So this is a child drowning in this beautiful lake that we have on the Wellesley campus. It's a tragic situation. So imagine also you've just gone to J. Crew or Anthropology or Marc Jacobs or somewhere, and you just bought this great pair of pants that you love. It's the best pair of pants you've ever bought, right? So you're walking past the pond or the lake wearing these pants, and you know the pants are going to be ruined if you get them wet. So what do? You know, do you stand there thinking, the pants or the child? The pants or the child? It's a serious moral dilemma. Not really. Most of us would think, okay, you need to go in there and save this drowning child, even if you're going to ruin your pants. And why do we think that? Well, we think the pants are just nowhere near as important as saving the life of a drowning, floundering infant, right? So the answer to that case seems to be you ought to wade in and save the child. Case B, this is where things get tricky. Someone is dying of famine in a foreign country. She has no food or water. She's stricken by disease and malnutrition. You can send money to save her. Or you can go and buy that nice pair of pants that we were just talking about. What should you do? Well, if we follow the same reasoning we used for the first case, you need to ask yourself, are these pants anywhere near as important as the life of this child who's dying of starvation? No, it looks like they're not, right? So again, it looks like you should send your money to starving famine victims overseas rather than buy those pants. So the second conclusion, I'm calling it claim B on the handout, that you ought to save the child rather than buy the pants, is much more controversial than claim A, which said you ought to save the child from drowning in the pond. But all that's required to get to that claim B, that you ought to send the money to the famine victim, is just the addition of one more premise. This is premise 3 on the argument. By donating to aid agencies, you can prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without sacrificing anything nearly as important. So claim B might be a little bit distressing for those of us who like nice pants, but it's actually going to get a lot worse. Things are going to get rapidly worse once you've accepted these first 3 premises. Because we now add premise 4. There are very many extremely poor people in the world, each of whom will suffer or die in the absence of aid donations. This is the next step in the argument. So there's not just one starving famine victim. There are very many. There are many other sources of poverty as well, not famine, that are causing many people to suffer and die and be in very dire circumstances. So if you accept that 4th premise too, you're going to get to Singer's startling conclusion. That is, until the day when global poverty is eradicated, if you do not donate all of your resources to poverty relief, except for those that you need to keep yourself from serious suffering, maybe keep your dependents from serious suffering as well, then you're doing something seriously morally wrong. Why? Just to draw this out, be completely clear about it, given the numbers of people who are suffering right now, the numbers of the global poor that I mentioned at the beginning, you can't just give up your pants. You've also got to give up your grande eggnog lattes that you're having every morning throughout the winter. You've got to give up that new Carly Rae Jepsen single that you wanted to buy on iTunes, your trip to Miami for spring break, your collected works of Michel Foucault that you wanted to buy on Amazon. Everything, all of those things of that nature, just aren't worth the deaths that you could avoid by sending the money you'd spend on them overseas instead. It's really key to notice here that the claim is that this is seriously wrong. So the idea is not that there's an optional moral requirement that it will be nice or good or generous or charitable of you to send your money overseas. Instead, he's saying this is a really strict moral requirement. It's just as strict, you might think, as a duty to not steal, to not murder someone, to not slice someone's leg off. This is a demanding moral requirement that most of us, as it happens, are violating pretty much at every moment of the day. Right? So this is what's so controversial and radical about what Singer is saying. So think about this on a personal level for a moment. Every single person in here is wearing clothes that are a lot nicer than they ought to be if we took this argument seriously. Everyone is planning some weekend trips away or trips during spring break that are a lot more luxurious than they would be if we really took this argument seriously. So there's some good news and some bad news here, according to Singer. The good news is that if people did take this seriously, if every rich person in the world did their part, then this startling conclusion that I've been talking about wouldn't actually be that demanding at all. So Singer claims that if each of the 855 million rich people, that was in 2009, gave $200 per year, that would total $171 billion, which is roughly the amount that Jeffrey Sachs claims is needed to reach all of the Millennium Development Goals that the UN has set. So global poverty would effectively be eradicated if every person played their part, and then you could start going back to Macy's and buying your nice pants. So that's good news. Yay. Unfortunately, the bad news here is that we know from past experience that most people are not going to take this argument seriously if they think about it at all. And most rich people are not going to give very much to starving people overseas. So in that case, if you want to do the right thing, if you want to really take the point of this argument to heart, then you're going to have to give up a lot. You're going to have to take up the slack of all those people who aren't taking it seriously. Perhaps indefinitely, so goodbye pants for you. You can wear some pants, but they're not going to be nice ones. They could be the ones that your aunt wore to her wedding in 1972, like nasty orange corduroy flares or something awful. That's what morality requires of you. A distressing conclusion. Okay, so I hope the argument is roughly clear. As I said, it's a fairly simple argument. None of the premises are very difficult to interpret. It seems to follow through nicely. It's valid in that way. So what I want to do is ask you to think about it. Try and pinpoint any problems you might find in the progression from the beginning to the end, because you need to stop it if you think the conclusion doesn't work. Or you might decide that you think Singer is right and he's actually making, a very compelling point about what we ought to do here. Many people have been persuaded by Singer in this way. So specifically, I'm going to ask you these two questions. Can you read them? It's a little small. So I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you, or one of the people next to you, and discuss these two questions. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll come together and talk about them. So the first question asks you to think about whether there might be any important differences between the case of the drowning child and the case of the famine victim, such that we can agree that we ought to save the child, but disagree, deny that we ought to save the famine victim. So that's the first point. Can you think of a difference that could kind of halt that argument from analogy? Second question is more about the practical claim that Singer is making. Many people think there are actually many difficulties in assisting the global poor that Singer isn't taking into account. So I want you to think about what those might be, and if there are difficulties of that kind, how that would figure into our assessment of Singer's argument. Are the questions clear? Any questions about the questions? Meta questions? No. Okay, so turn to someone next to you, and I'll give you 5 minutes to discuss it. So we'll go through these questions one by one. Let's start with this first one about whether there's any important differences between these two cases that suggest that we can say, yes, save the child, but no, don't save every famine victim that you come across. Any views about that? What did you have to say about that? Suggestions? What might be a salient difference? Yes. Sorry, I can't see your name.
Well, I'm Marcine, and what we were discussing is that with the child, he's right in front of you, and so you feel guilty, you'd be complicit in it directly if you didn't do anything. Whereas with the famine, you can share the blame, and I know that sounds bad, but you can be like, oh, well, no one else did anything, why should I? So I think that's the biggest difference that you can find between the two.
Good. Okay, good. So I think this is something that Singer brings up in his article, right? That the fact that it's only you there out by the lake is a significant difference, whereas if you're just one of many, somehow your responsibility is lessened. Are there any responses to that suggestion? Does anyone want to, do we all agree that that's a sufficient reason to distinguish the two, such that we have a duty in the one case but not in the other? No? Some heads are shaking? Yes. Yiling, is it? Ying? No, sorry.
Okay, hi, I'm Ying. So we were discussing, and we felt that in case A, there's like sort of only one solution. You jump in and you save the child, whereas with case B, there's a multitude of ways that you can approach the issue. Like if you assume that like putting money, like donating money to aid agencies will help, you have to assume that whatever the aid agencies are doing is the right way to try to solve the issue of poverty.
Good. So it sounds to me like what you're doing is maybe questioning premise 3 on the handout, right? So this was the claim that by donating to aid agencies, you can prevent suffering and death. Some people think that donating to aid agencies won't do that, right? But that other things might, right? So Ying said other things might be more useful. And I'm assuming you're suggesting we should do those other things, right? So you're questioning the particular means, but you're not questioning the underlying duty. Does anyone have a response to this first before we move on to other reasons? This first suggestion we had, which did get to that deeper moral issue, right? Which said we don't really have a duty in the case of the famine victim because there's many people who could help, not just us. Does anyone have a response to that? Yes.
Hi, I'm Elza. We were discussing about that it's not in claim A, it's not the moral, or in claim B, it's not that it's not your moral duty, it's that there is a different intermediary agent that is completing your moral duty. And so in case A, you are the agent, you are saving the child, and in case B, you are sort of having somebody else complete the action for you.
Yeah, so that seems important, right? Why is that important, though? What is it about that that's significant?
Well, I think it brings up the problems that were previously brought up with whether the intermediary agent is acting in accordance to your personal moral of saving the child, or whether they might be corrupt or acting in different ways.
Good, so it's a principal agent problem, right? Okay, so again, this seems to be a kind of concern about the particular way that Singer is suggesting we fulfill the duty, but it's not an objection to the duty itself. So you might say, well, aid donations haven't proven to be that effective so far, right? But instead, what you ought to be doing is maybe donating all of your time to political campaigning for better policies towards the developing world. Or maybe you ought to be sending your money to sort of population control, birth control organisations, right? Rather than just sending cash over, you're thinking about longer term trends. So there could be a whole range of other things you do that wouldn't run into some of the problems, the practical problems you're raising. So let's try again. Philosophers are always trying to move away from the practical and into the fully abstract, right? Does anyone here have a reason to actually resist Singer's argument at that morally fundamental level? Is there another significant difference between these cases that makes you think that we just don't have as strong a duty to help the famine victim, even if we could with just as much ease? Yes.
About this idea of the saliency of the issue to you as an agent yourself, because in the first case you're actually seeing that individual and they have a face, and that might, elicit a lot more of a feeling of moral duty, whereas in case 2, whatever you're providing, whether it's time or it's money, it's really just a statistic, so you're not feeling that same level of moral draw to the situation.
Yeah, good. So I think there's definitely a strong psychological difference between these cases. Right? So the question has got to be, what relevance does that psychological difference have? When I showed you these slides, I went Google image searching famine victims, and actually this one is quite cute, right? This is a really sweet looking baby. If you do Google image search on famine victim, you're going to see a lot of extremely non-cute things, right? I mean, it's very striking, very depressing. I think for many people, just looking at those pictures alone is going to have a pretty strong psychological force. But you might think that and still think, nonetheless, someone's in front of you, there's a sense of urgency, psychologically it matters. Does it matter morally? Is that a fact about us that shouldn't really factor into our obligations? That's going to be the question. Yes, Crystal.
My name is Crystal, and we were discussing the issue about distance, but Singer discounts the fact that we should discriminate against children who are right in front of us versus a famine victim across the globe. So this issue of, whether, we can see the child or whether there's an agency in front of us doesn't really affect the underlying moral obligation, because I think what he's trying to say is you should save both children, regardless of where they are in the world. The moral obligation underneath is still the same.
Yeah, good. I think you would say that, right? That our psychological reactions are a natural, maybe unfortunate feature of us, maybe, right? If we didn't take them so seriously, we probably would help many more people. But that's something we need to get over and work around rather than simply accept. I think we'll take you way in the back.
So there's something that we were discussing, and that there's 2 key differences between the cases, which is that in the first case, we have someone who already owns the pair of jeans, or whatever pants they have. Whereas in the second case, there's someone who's going to have to forego luxury. So there is a sort of different sense of loss in either one of those cases, which could end up affecting morally whether someone decides to act or not. Because in the first case, they already own something. In the second, it's just something that they could have lost, but maybe because they don't practically have at the moment, the sense of loss isn't as great or isn't.
Yeah, I think that's true, right? There's this literature in psychology that says that humans are very averse to losing things they already have. So that's another psychological fact about us. You could reconstruct the examples that didn't have that feature, right? So that might be a reason to adjust the way that it's set up. It probably isn't a reason to dismiss the entire argument, right? Yes.
And responding to your question about whether our moral obligation is lessened, I would say that in the first example with the child in the pond, we use our own eyes to assess the situation. Whereas in the second example, we're relying on others, maybe on journalists or on nonprofits, to relay the situation to us. And so there's a certain amount of trust that we must take in the representation of the situation. So we have to trust in others that they're giving us a correct account of the famine. And so I think that in that case, the doubt, a shade of doubt could be argued that that could lessen our moral obligation because we have a doubt about whether the representation of the famine is actually correct.
Yeah, good. So I think you're right. If there really was really immense uncertainty about what aid organisations could do, what they would do with your money, right, this would be a reason to hold back in that second case, or at least it would lessen the force of the duty. You might think what you want to do is produce, expected value, and expected value is going to depend on the probability of the money that you send over actually getting to where it needs to go, right? So Singer has thought about this, obviously, more, I think, in the book, the recent book, than the original article, where he seemed quite confident that just sending your dollars over would fix things pretty quickly, right? Now he's more worried about it, but he thinks he's got an answer, so I anticipated this suggestion and went online to this website, which I suggest you check out if you haven't been to it, givewell.org. So it's a charity rating organisation. You probably can't read this, unfortunately, but what they do is they go through a range of different charities, not just international ones, but there are many global poverty-related charities listed there, and they kind of rank them and check them according to a bunch of criteria. These are the main ones here: strong evidence of positive impact on people's lives, highly cost-effective activities, so you're not wasting your money by sending the money, room for more funding. Some organisations have so much money they don't know what to do with it effectively, transparency, accountability. So there are people out there, not just this organisation, but other people too, trying to alleviate some of these concerns. So it turns out the top 3 charities listed there at the moment, which are related to global poverty, are these ones: the Against Malaria Foundation. There's a little link that you can click on to immediately donate to it. Give Directly, which transfers money straight away directly to poor households in Kenya, so there's not this sort of principal agent worry, maybe, you might think. And then the Schistosomiasis Control Initiative. So this is a tropical disease you can contribute to trying to fix. So I think the issue was a really serious one, but people are at least trying to get around that particular worry. Yes?
It's not necessarily sending your money to an agency abroad that's going to solve poverty, and noticing that there is poverty in local countries. For example, in the U.S., if someone would say, well, whether I send my money to Africa or I can send my money here and help people poverty in domestically. So I think it's also people focusing on domestic poverty rates as opposed to solely focusing as poverty as like a global factor, that's something that's distant and away from you. So I think that accounts into how people allocate their money also.
Yeah, that is a really good point. So you could maybe suggest this is another salient difference between the two cases, right? You might be assuming that in the case of the drowning child, this is your fellow citizen, right? Or maybe your fellow resident of the US drowning in the pond. Whereas these other people don't have that kind of social and political relationship with you. And many philosophers do think that that kind of relationship brings with it really strong duties of justice that aren't present when you move outside the borders of the state. So you might think we have a special duty, philosophers call it, to help people in our own country who are suffering, that's stronger than the one to help people outside our country. So I think that's the most important type of difference that philosophers have pointed to. There's a lot of disagreement about why that's relevant, how it's relevant, but it does seem to many of us to be at least a little bit relevant. What do you think that Singer would say? Singer doesn't agree with it, right? He's not going down that road. What do you think Singer could say to try and respond to that suggestion? What would he say? So you could either help the poor floundering American infant in the pond, or you could send your money overseas, or you could do other kinds of charitable activities for people overseas. Why might it seem to Singer that it would be better to do the foreign charity donations rather than be concerned about people here? Any suggestions? Yeah.
Perhaps Singer would argue that in the overall marginal utility, saving that child in Africa would be more helpful because they are at a greater disadvantage than the American child who's drowning in the lake, and that your money would be really, really like powerful in that aspect. So perhaps you would argue that it's a question of scale, and your impact could be really a lot greater in that situation.
Yeah, good. So there's 2 points really, right? So one is there are people overseas who are poor tend to be a lot poorer, right, than people in developed countries. And there's also a lot more of them, which you didn't mention, right? There are many, many people overseas. So apparently, I'm not sure if these figures are still current, but the cost of saving a life through a good charity is somewhere between $200 and $2,000 US dollars. The median cost of saving a life in the US is $2.2 million, right? So you can see that if you spent that $2.2 million on helping people overseas, you'd be saving a lot more lives, right? So for Singer, it comes down to that really kind of basic calculation about the amount of badness, if you go back to his first premise, you can eliminate by sending your money overseas rather than keeping it within the country. You want to push back on this? Yes, good.
So is Singer assuming that the donation is coming from an advance fund?
She can't wait for the microphone.
Hello, I'm Lois. So is Singer assuming that the donation is coming from an advanced economy? So for example, if the donor was in, let's say, India or China, where there is a significant amount of their population in poverty, wouldn't there be a same amount of effect if their donation was done domestically as opposed to their donation being sent internationally?
Yes, that's
so is he putting
clarification.
implicitly weight on donations from advanced economies?
He is addressing the argument to people in OECD countries. But you're right. In a way, the decision, you don't have a sort of domestic versus global justice problem, a conflict so much if you're within a developing country. Because the global poor are also the domestic poor for you. So you've got at least, you don't have that problem. You've got a few other problems, but you don't have that one, right? So that's one thing. We'll take your question. I think we kind of moved into the second question anyway. There's practical difficulties, so we can continue on this rather than moving to that. Go ahead.
Well, we sort of came up with a question that sort of incorporated the two, and that was the level of engagement required. And the first one is of an immediate nature, in which someone is required to engage for a moment, save the life, and then presumably the connection can dissolve. The second case, so the fundamental difference that we identified was that the second case requires the engagement of future resources and future opportunities that come from having resources without necessarily knowing. So this ends up being sort of practical as well when people don't know if there will be health issues. How do you determine need that foreseeable need for your family, for how many dependents you might be responsible for, whether they're children or aged family members. And I think that level of engagement is kind of this pivot point, because when you can dissolve the relationship quickly, it is easier for people to morally engage, for a longer and extensive commitment. It requires much more.
Good, yeah. So I said before that the worry about domestic duties was maybe the major objection, but I think this is the other major objection to Singer's argument, the major concern about it, that this is a really demanding duty, right? And it's demanding for the reason that you mentioned, that you have to keep on giving. This is not a one-off interaction. It's a long-term relationship with the global poor that's going to have a huge impact on your own personal projects, your relationships, maybe your relationship to your children, right, that you mentioned. I mean, so you can think maybe if we reconstructed the case of the pond, right? Now you're living in a country with many ponds and many unsupervised children who are incredibly clumsy, right? They keep falling into ponds. So you go out, you're going on a nice little walk to the convenience store to get some milk. There's like 20,000 drowning children on your way to the convenience store. This would start to seem like a situation where you didn't have a duty to save all of them either anymore, right? So it does seem like this issue of kind of cumulative demands is a really significant difference between the cases. Good. So just to sort of sum up that discussion, that was really great. I think you hit all the major points there. There's two types of objections you might make to Singer's argument. The first are practical objections concerning the likely effectiveness of international aid. We didn't go into detail about that, but there are many worries that social scientists have raised about that. We also saw there are responses to that problem, though. One, it's not obvious that all aid donations are totally ineffective, right? You might look at the givewell.org website and see some examples of pretty impressive-looking aid organisations. We also haven't done that much aid. Aid has been pretty small, really, by comparison to the other things that rich people spend money on. So maybe, some people say, like Jeff Sachs, that we just need to give more of it. We haven't really given it a good go. Another objection, another response Singer can make to these practical worries, just say, shift away from the focus on aid donations per se to broader kinds of activities that might be more effective. So although those practical objections are the ones that really spring to people's mind quite quickly, I think, when they look at this argument, it's really the moral objections, ones about duties to people within your own country, worries about excessively demanding moral obligations that people really press, in philosophy anyway. So many of us just really can't accept that morality requires us to sacrifice that much for people who we will never meet. Morality just doesn't demand that much of us. We could be wrong about that. It could be that our own views about that need to change. But because it's so counterintuitive, many people feel like they need a different kind of reason to help the global poor than this one. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about that different type of reason and see if you want to take that on board either instead of this one or in addition to it. So this is, you can flip your handout over. This second argument is advanced by Thomas Poga. He's at Yale now. His argument takes the form of a negative duty. As I mentioned earlier, a negative duty is a duty not to do something that you're doing. So this is distinctive as compared to Singer's positive duty argument. Again, the argument can be stated quite simply, so I'm going to go through it slowly and I'm going to ask you again to discuss it with each other. First premise is we have a negative duty not to harm others. In particular, if we can help it, we ought to neither contribute to nor benefit from burdens suffered by other people. This is a pretty standard feature of our moral framework. We're not supposed to harm other people. 2, there exists a global order, a global institutional structure that's imposed by the global affluent, so rich people, on the global poor. I have a quote on the handout which specifies what that global order is supposed to contain according to Poga. So it comprises a set of treaty and convention-based rules about security, trade, property rights, human rights, and the environment. These are rules that govern global rule makers. So, for instance, rules governing representation at the World Bank, the IMF, United Nations, WTO. Also, various norms and standards associated with territorial sovereignty, so the state system. Policies adopted by global rule-making bodies, so the intellectual property agreement built into the WTO, and the various foreign policies that the world's powerful states exert. So the claim was, that was premise 2, there exists a global order made up of all those and related things that the global rich impose on the global poor. Premise 3, most of the global poverty problem could be eliminated through minor modifications of this global order. That's a pretty bold claim, so you might think, like what? One pair of features that Poga likes to focus on are what he calls the international resource privilege and the international borrowing privilege. So I'll use those as examples. The first of those, the international resource privilege, is the fact that in current international practice, whoever is able to gain coercive control over a country's population is entitled to sell, recognized internationally as legally authorized to sell the resources of that country to foreigners. Right? So if you get control of a country, you can sell the natural resources in that country to people overseas. That's a legal action. So this means that some dictator in a very oppressive country is free to sell away, say, all of the oil reserves of that country, spend all the money on himself, it's usually him, or worse, use it to cement his oppression of the population. Right? So this is a harmful feature of international law. Similarly, in international practice, whoever can maintain coercive control over a country's population is recognized internationally as legally authorized to borrow in the name of that country. Right? So again, dictators can use their position as the head of a country to borrow money from other countries and use that money, in many cases, to maintain their oppressive rule. And they don't ever have to worry about paying back the money themselves. Right? It's going to end up being a massive debt that the oppressed themselves have to pay. So those are a couple of examples. What Poger says is that in order to modify those, all we would have to do is just acknowledge power holders in a country as legally able to do those things only if they pass certain minimal standards of accountability. Right? So we could change international law overnight in order to adjust those two really harmful features. Other things he suggests are changes in WTO law. So in particular, he's worried about the intellectual property agreement built into the WTO. That should either be eviscerated or it should be much more applied in a much more relaxed fashion for developing country cases. The end of agricultural protectionism on the part of OECD countries. So there are a bunch of different things of that kind that you can read more about in his book that he thinks would not be that difficult. They would be minor modifications, he claims, and in particular they wouldn't impose very extensive costs on people in affluent countries. So that was premise 4 that I just said then. At most we'd get slight reductions in the income of the affluent if we made these and other related moves. So claim 5 is, by failing to make those modifications that are not very costly, the global affluent are harming the global poor. Right? We're not making these really minor changes that would make huge differences in the lives of these people. So the idea of harm is, it sounds fairly simple at first glance, but it's actually a fairly complicated notion. So I want to say a couple of things about what he means by harm there. So when you talk about harming someone, you're talking about making them worse off as compared to some other state of affairs. So what state of affairs does Poger have in mind? What's his baseline when he talks about the rich harming the poor in these ways? There's two main options. One thing he might be doing is making what's known as a diachronic comparison. In that case, you say that the global poor are worse off under the current global order than they were at an earlier time. Right? So the global order makes the poor worse off than they were at a previous stage of history. That's a hard move to make because actually global poverty has declined over the past century. Right? So it's not obvious that the global poor are worse off now than they were earlier. It's also tricky because the people have changed. Right? It's hard to make those kinds of comparisons. They're not between the same people. So it's better to understand Poger as making a different kind of claim about harm, using a different understanding of what harm is. This is not a diachronic comparison, a comparison across time. It's called a synchronic comparison. So the idea here is that the global poor are worse off under the current global order than they would be under an alternative accessible global order. So stick to the current century. So the situation of the global poor has improved by comparison to 1900, right? At least global poverty has been reduced. So that the diachronic comparison doesn't work, right? But if the comparison was instead an alternative 2013B, in which we actually had made these modifications to the global order that improve the lot of the people who are currently suffering, it would look like there's been a harm going on. The global poor are harmed by comparison to an alternative accessible global order. Right? So that's the notion of harm that Poger's working with in this argument. Okay, final premise, and then I'll let you discuss this. You yourself, every single person in this room, as an affluent person, are culpably complicit. You're to blame, you're at fault. By virtue of participating in and benefiting from the global order, you're to blame, you're complicit in the suffering of these people. So let me just highlight a couple of features of this before we talk about it. The first, as I noted earlier, is that it's based on a negative duty, right? So it's not a positive duty, it's a duty not to harm. Poga does think we have positive duties to rescue people who are suffering as well. So he's saying this is an additional reason. He also thinks that we tend to think that negative duties are much stronger, more stringent and demanding than positive duties are, right? So he thinks that if he can show that we have a negative duty to help people who are suffering overseas, it's much more likely to persuade people. So this is the reason that he's trying to advance this argument. Though he also thinks it's true. It's not a purely rhetorical move. So it's a negative duty. Second, Poga is emphasizing the role of the global order in maintaining or increasing poverty, but he's not denying that there are also domestic factors that figure into the situation too. So he's not making the implausible claim that the global order is doing everything. He does claim that the global order is a huge part of the problem. And he also says, it often works through domestic factors. So features of the global institutional order, like the international resource privilege and the borrowing privilege, affect domestic politics in ways that are really problematic. So they're kind of filtered through domestic politics in that way. Okay, so this is the second argument. As I said, it's fairly simple, it's novel, it's highly controversial again. So I'm going to ask you two questions about it. And again, you can turn to the person next to you, maybe the person on the other side of you, to discuss them. First, do you agree that you personally share some moral responsibility for the deaths of millions of poor people? If this is true, we're currently surrounded by a huge amount of murderers in this room right now. You should have brought your bodyguards to the Albright Institution because there you go. Everyone here is responsible for the deaths of many people. So I have a quote up there that Poga uses to try and really drive that point home. Second question, if you don't agree with Poga's conclusion, many people don't, which of the steps in his argument do you think are at fault? So you need to go through and see which of those you can cast doubt on if you want to resist the conclusion. If you actually think the conclusion is very compelling, you need to anticipate what other people might say so that you can defend it against them. So again, I'll give you 5 minutes to discuss that and then we'll bring it together. Okay, all right, so let's talk about these things. Let's start with the first one. So who here agrees that they personally share moral responsibility for the deaths of millions of poor people, which is the implication of Poga's argument? Yeah, some of us do, good. And just like in the case of Singer, Poga has persuaded many people of this. This is the first time you've read it maybe, but it could be that it changes your life. So some of us agree with this conclusion. The rest of you don't. Maybe we could hear from the people who don't. What do you think is wrong with Poga's argument? Yes.
Especially with the assumption that all people would then be murderers, I think it's important to note that in every country there's different levels of power for different citizens. So in my mind, some citizens would be more akin to murderers, while some would be like half murderers or even not at all. I don't know if you wanted to add anything about discussion. But Maggie made the distinction between helping and what? Go ahead.
Okay. We distinguish between helping someone and not harming them, and that there's a great difference between those two concepts, both in terms of the end result of the people that are being helped or not harmed, and those doing the helping or those not harming people. So it would both situations would leave the world in a very different place, both in terms of how things would progress over the years and the immediate result.
Good, so those are two very good points. I take it they're addressing different premises of the argument. So the first one is placing some doubt on premise 6, or really it's the conclusion of the argument, right? This idea that you are culpably complicit in the harm. So the claim there was, well, maybe, but that's going to be a much more persuasive claim about some people rather than others, right? There's got to be degrees of responsibility to do with your own degree of kind of causal relation to the harm, you might say. So this at least needs to be adjusted to take account of that. Maybe Poga would agree with that, right? The second claim is placing some pressure on the idea that what's going on here is really harm, right? So you said we need to distinguish between just failing to help someone and harming them, right? I I think that's a really important point. A lot of people are concerned about that aspect of the argument. So really what you're doing is placing pressure on the synchronic conception of harm that we talked about. Right? So Pogue is essentially claiming that because we could have done much better for the global poor, via a different global order, then we're essentially harming them. But that seems like a real stretch of the concept of harm for many people. Like right now, I could be giving each of you a cupcake, right? But I'm not doing that because I don't want to. So I'm not giving you cupcakes. Does it follow that I'm harming you because I'm failing to benefit you? Doesn't say, yes? Oh, okay, all right. Well, send me an email later and I'll try and rectify that. Now, of course, there's a big difference here, right, between not giving someone a cupcake and not helping them escape poverty. You might think that's relevant, but it does place pressure on the idea that what's going on here is harming. You might think that what really is happening here is that Pogue is advocating a positive duty in drag, right? It's a duty much like singers, but he's presenting it as harm. It's one response to make. Yes?
I think the other section that we did not discuss when we discussed harm is it's not just contributing to harm, but also benefiting from not doing anything, and that needs to be taken in consideration as well.
Very nice. Okay, so this could be a response to, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Sam? Yeah, it could be a response to Sam. You could say, well, okay, it may not be clear that we're causally contributing to the global order, at least in the case of many of us. But we're nonetheless all benefiting from it. And you're right, that was part of the initial claim, that you're harming someone if you're benefiting from something that oppresses them. So good, some pushing back on that idea.
This existing global order only benefit the global affluent is false. Like United Nations, IMF, World Bank, although it's true that they're founded by affluent countries, but their main benefactor are actually those poor countries. It's mostly like rich countries donating money to poor countries. I feel like it's simplifying the problem by saying global affluent is harming the global poor with this existing global order.
Good. So here, I mean, let's kind of work out which premise you're pushing back on there. The second one? Well, that's about the imposition of the global order on the poor. So you're saying that's a question really about whether or not the global poor consent to the order or they have a role in producing it, right? So the claim there is that it's chiefly rich countries that have formed and largely run the global order.
The question is this definition of this word imposing. So it sounds like negative, but is this really negative for global poor to have these organizations and this current order?
Good, yeah. So you're saying maybe it's being, if you think of imposing does have this connotation of being sort of like a bad imposition maybe, or being harmful in some way, right? And you're suggesting even if it's the case that rich countries have largely created this order, it's been beneficial to developing countries in many ways. So you're denying there's actually, I mean, what would you say about premise 3 though, right? There are certain aspects of the global order that are problematic. So Pogue is actually a big fan of, say, international trade, many international institutions. He agrees with you that many have made huge advances in helping people at the bottom. But he's nonetheless saying there are certain features that remain that are quite harmful. And we could just change those. We're not eliminating the global economy. We're just making modifications that would have a huge impact. Does that make you feel better about it when you think about it that way? I do think one important point here that I really think is very important is that, you know, Pogue is a philosopher, not a social scientist. He's making pretty strong empirical claims about the effects of these institutions on people in developing countries that are very, very controversial, right? I mean, he's done a lot of research on this. He's a very well-informed man. But nonetheless, there remains extraordinary disagreement amongst social scientists about these issues, about the effects of global institutions, the causes of global poverty. So you can certainly push back on the argument by questioning the degree to which the global order is really getting in the way of poverty alleviation. So again, this is an empirical issue that you need to settle in order to get all the way to the end of the argument. We'll take one more comment and have to move on, unfortunately.
To say, like, about number 3, which we seem to have been discussing. So when we talk about change, so you said that Pogue is a very well-informed man, and I'm sure he is, but the thing with these changes is that if they were really minor, then it's hard to believe that they wouldn't, or there wouldn't be more awareness about them and there wouldn't be more steps taken to try to actually do them. So they may be minor on the scale of the organization as a whole, but given that we as citizens of affluent countries are unable individually to help those minor modifications actually occur, since they also don't, I mean, you said domestic politics does play a role, but ultimately these are byproducts, these problems are byproducts of international institutions. And so our impact is even lessened, you could argue. And so our culpability is then, I would argue, even more lessened because they're not really as minor. These modifications are not really as minor in the global order as Poggi maybe might be biased toward saying they are.
Yeah, good. So you could push back on premise 3, as you mentioned, also 4. You could say there wouldn't actually be minor modifications, they'd be fairly large. And also they might impose pretty large costs on people in developed countries, right? So he could be understating the case on both of those fronts. Right? All right, so I'm not going to try and settle those issues, but I think those are the kinds of places you want to sort of press on the argument and see whether Poggi can defend himself against them or not. So I'm just going to sum up. So we've considered 2 answers to the question that is the title of my talk, why should we care about global poverty? One claims we should care about global poverty because we have a positive moral duty to prevent serious suffering wherever it occurs, if we can do so without sacrificing something of comparable moral importance. And there's a lot of suffering overseas. That's the reason there. Second argument claims that we should care because we have a negative duty not to harm others, and that we rich participants in the global order are actively harming the global poor by virtue of benefiting from and maybe causally contributing to that order. We saw some difficulties with both of those answers. The first one seems to have extraordinarily demanding implications. It also seems to not leave much room for duties to our co-citizens. So it seems to edge out domestic justice in a way that might be worrying. The second one depends on some really controversial conceptual claims about harm and also empirical claims about how the world works that you might want to reject. So what should we conclude? I'm just going to leave you to worry about those substantive moral questions, which is what philosophers like to do. I'm going to step back and make a broader methodological point about the relationship between philosophy and social science. The 3 questions that I began with at the very beginning of the talk: how can we explain global poverty? How can we solve it? Why should we care about it? And not as independent as you might think at first glance. So it turns out that we can't work out what our moral duties are in this area without having, a better grip on what it is that causes poverty and what we can do to fix it. Both Singer and Poggi tend to imply that we actually know what to do about global poverty. And the chief problem here is just motivating people to do something about it. But, explaining and solving global poverty is actually an extremely complicated affair. It's not that easy to work out what we ought to do. So it turns out that we really can't know what we ought to do until we know the answers to some of those other questions. So philosophy can only take us so far in these areas, but also, if that's true, it's also the case that social science can only take us so far. So social science alone can't answer all of the important questions there are about global poverty. Even once all of the facts are in, some pressing moral questions are going to remain about what our responsibilities are to people outside our country, how much we ought to make their concerns our own concerns, how much we're obliged to sacrifice in order to produce that result. So if we want to actually persuade people to do something about global poverty, we need to answer those questions for them as well. So I'm just going to end by saying that I hope that you Albright Fellows will continue to think about those questions alongside the more practical ones as you work on your projects discussed together over the next 3 weeks. Thanks very much.